There's a lot of noise in the crypto sphere and very little signal. We're here to amplify that signal. My name is Nicholas Merton, and you're listening to The AMP, powered by deVadoss. We've got John deVadoss here for our next episode of The AMP. John is a longtime friend I've known in the crypto space over the past couple of years. We met in the depths of the bear market and crypto markets, and he's got a really esteemed background that I'm excited to dive into and learn a little bit about his journey on. He's an ex-Microsoft employee for over a decade and a half. He helped to grow one of the major incubation programs under Microsoft, doing $500 million in recurring annual revenue. And he's also played a role in scaling out 2 startups that he's exited in the process. So I'm really excited to dive into the conversation. John, thank you for making the time. It's always a pleasure, man.
Thank you, Nick. Always a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you, my friend.
Awesome. So I want to go ahead and kick things off here a little bit. For those who may not know about your background, you come from the traditional world of technology at Microsoft. And what I think is so fascinating about you is you've not only got a lot of background behind you in your field of expertise, but you've been really drawn to the, in a sense, decentralization of traditional centralized technologies. So I want to go ahead and just get your general scoop of your background, what drives you and what drags you towards decentralized technology in the crypto space.
Yeah, definitely. So just a bit of a personal note, folks might not know, I grew up in Africa, Nick, and I'm an American now. I have a very personal, view of what freedom means. And the reason for this context is, as you said, I spent close to 2 decades working at Microsoft. I also chaired the planning commission for a very large West Coast city here in the US for 8 years. And so what leads me to crypto, to blockchain, is this firm conviction that centralized systems are complex, unnecessarily complex and corrupt. And for the common man to have a chance to have the opportunity, we have to look to decentralized systems, i.e. blockchain and beyond. And that is my firm conviction, Nick.
Very interesting. So basically, from your background, John, you've seen how traditional centralized systems can grow to a point where they almost have that feeling similar to the banking system that they're too big to fail, that there's no way that they can be challenged, or anytime there's a problem, something's always going to give. They're always going to be able to continue forward and growing their power monopoly. You, on the other hand, have talked a lot about decentralization. So I'm curious to hear a little bit, John, crypto, since we chatted back during the bear market, I mean, as a market has scaled up much larger. But I'm really curious to hear where you think that 5-10 year vision is going to be for the whole crypto space as a whole and blockchain. And how do you think it's going to impact our lives at the end of the day?
Oh, certainly. I want to just maybe provide a bit of a context. I do believe, it is my belief that the financial system, we're going to hit a significant crisis, a breaking point, if you will, in the very short term. And so the implications, firstly, with respect to, I guess you could say, crypto, is that consumers, the common man, is going to look for ways to preserve their assets and their savings. And I believe there is going to be a significant uptick. The pendulum is swinging and will swing significantly. On the other side, with respect to blockchain, and I see a distinction of, Bitcoin versus blockchain. What I mean by blockchain is platforms. We have platforms, Ethereum, M3, and more, which are really platforms in the true sense of the word. What this means, however, is that in the history of computing, in the history of computer science, software technology, platforms, we have never seen an economic platform, Nick. We have seen platforms galore. PCs, mainframes, the cloud, SOA, services, but blockchains are economic platforms, which means that intrinsically you have baked in crypto economic protocols. And this is the big shift we are seeing with respect to IT and enterprises as they finally wake up and understand the implications of exploiting and building on economic platforms. And for this, we need tools. We need developer tools. We need developers, the millions of developers across the world, to be able to comprehend and again to exploit, to create value and extract value out of this. And this is a personal passion of mine with respect to developers, because I believe unless and until the blockchain space looks beyond our little corner and we embrace we welcome every single developer across the world, that's when we're going to see this tipping point from a developer and a platform adoption. Now, like I said, there is the consumer side, which I believe, as people eventually look through the fact that the emperor has no clothes in the existing financial system, that is going to be the tipping point, in my opinion.
So I want to go back on one thing you talked about, John, which is, for me, I think one of the strongest points you've always emphasized when we've chatted is this idea of having an economic layer on top of protocols. And again, I think a lot of people kind of are still don't really get why this is going to be very impactful in the world. But what you brought up earlier that I think is so incredible to think about is that what we've seen so far built on top of protocols like Ethereum in the crypto space has already been pretty incredible. We've built decentralized exchanges. We've built decentralized protocols where you can earn interest. And as you pointed out, with the kind of innovation we have seen, this is with a relatively small pool of engineers when we're talking about the global numbers, because of the restrictions of the languages people have to use. They have to use these like really niche implementations of JavaScript like Solidity, right? And you have to build within that language framework. You can't use all the languages you're already previously familiar with. I know at N3, for example, for Neo, that you guys have taken a different approach and stuff, which is basically focusing on bringing in the traditional language framework for people to be able to build applications in languages they're familiar with. And I think that when you can open up the floodgates to more engineers like that, give them the tools they need, and on top of that, you let them use the languages they're used to, the innovation we're going to see, it's going to be our S-curve moment for crypto and blockchain as a whole.
Absolutely. No, I think you're spot on. Just to provide a little bit more context on what I mean by this economic platform, Nick, is, you look at, for example, Bitcoin or any of the existing DeFi protocols, right? They are not applications in the classic sense of the world. They are not apps. They are institutions in the sense they are self-governing, self-directing, and self-propagating. Now, we could never have built an institution on any of the previous waves of platforms. And this is why I draw the very clear distinction that these are economic platforms, right? Every single one of the existing protocols out there. And your second point, you're absolutely right. Developers, right? There's approximately 25 million professional developers out there, and they use a variety of languages. So the key is, again, like you said, a polyglot perspective, like what, with N3 we have done with the toolkit, is to say, look, it doesn't matter. You like C# or JavaScript, you like a Python, it doesn't really matter. But what you want and what we will give you is the best in class industry experience, Nick. And we have built the best developer tools in the entire industry. We have built this because I know this because I built the tools for Microsoft, and I can tell you what we have right now is comparable, if not superior, to what Azure has, to what Amazon Web Services have done.
Very cool. So on that point, John, for people who may not know, one of the things that I forgot to mention as an accolade earlier that builds into this point, you helped build the framework for .NET, which is still used. It's one of the most widespread, if I'm not mistaken, kind of like language frameworks that people utilize when building. So I wanted to ask you, and maybe a little bit more detail and stuff, what does it look like for an engineer and stuff if they want to utilize the toolkits that you guys have built? And again, some of the points as to why it might be such a revolution in getting new engineers into the space.
Yeah, definitely. So what we have done is we've made it as simple and as friction-free as, for example, building and using a Lambda function on Amazon Web Services, or an Azure function on the Microsoft Azure Cloud. The same experience. You go to VS or VS Code, we have the extensions, add, click, push button. In about 3-4 minutes, you can build a smart contract. And that is something that has not been done before, right? But there's more to it, right? What we have done, and in my role also as a governing board member of the Global Blockchain Business Council, Nick, we are working on industry standards, open protocols, open schemas. I believe it is going to be a multi-chain world. That's a fact. It's just a fact. And so in that world, interoperability becomes critical, becomes key. And so I am working actively on standards like, for example, the token taxonomy framework, where we have the ability to create a meta model, a taxonomy, if you will, to create, and instantiate tokens. Tokens meaning, digital assets of any form factor. So what we have done in the tool set is to also make it open standards compatible, so that you have the ability to translate the work you're doing, your IP across, obviously multiple instantiations with respect to the underlying platform. And I think this is a critical deal because I have seen the movie before, with the cloud stacks at Microsoft, with web services. I was a founding member of the web services protocol standards. And so I know exactly how this movie plays. And it's absolutely critical that we ensure developers have a base of openness, schemas, protocols, and interoperability.
Very interesting. So on that point, John, maybe just to give people an understanding of this concept of interoperability. So we've got multiple different networks out there, or layer ones, if you will, these different protocols that can do certain types of things. They have differing degrees of scalability, decentralization, and because of that, they might be useful for certain things. But I wanted to ask you on the topic of interoperability, an example maybe we could explain to people to understand this concept of chains communicating with one another. One of them that comes to mind that I think is probably very practical for people who have experimented with these different chains is bridging. But I'm assuming that interoperability doesn't stop and end at bridging. It also has to do with understanding, as you mentioned, common frameworks and standards to make sure that maybe even smart contracts could interact with one another cross-chain.
Absolutely. So, so it's a very good question. I think you're spot on. Just to give a sense of how to think about it, I'll give you two perspectives. One is if you look at the commercial perspective, you may have supply chains, consortia, for example, right? All business is multi-party business. Inherently, you have multiple parties coming together. So these parties might want to preserve some level of what is a private version of a blockchain and what is a public, for example, version of the blockchain. So in this case, you may have multiple players, multiple entities, multiple parties. And like you said, to be able to bridge, to be able to just connect, to share, to collaborate, you need these open standards for the schemas, for the protocols, right? We're not saying that, there's going to be a one-size-fits-all, because we know that never works. However, it is a fact that multiple business parties will need to, at a minimum, connect, collaborate, right, and share. On the other side, if you look at the geopolitical perspective, Nick, I think it's pretty obvious that there's going to be multiple hotspots, right? It's highly unlikely that the powers that be will accept one. So there will be, by definition, multiple. And of course, again, geopolitical collaboration, connecting and communication will need to happen. So there again, you need open schemas, standards and protocols for perhaps, what might be, let's say, 3 or 4 different global hotspots with respect to blockchain consortia, and then the need to connect these 3 or 4 global hotspots.
Absolutely. So I wanted to, so if I could just recap it here in this case, John, you see that as time progresses, the traditional, if we're viewing this in a purely tech basis, and I want to try to break it down as best as possible, you have this kind of grand vision over the next decade or so that we're not only going to see the perfect storm, the opportunity where a lot of the centralized giants of today, your Amazons, Microsofts, Googles, that have all this kind of architecture and infrastructure in place that's centralized. We were talking about AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. All these systems, not only maybe enterprise systems, but other types of systems we can't even imagine, are going to start to lose their ground in the grand scheme of things. They're going to lose their position in the world, their authority in the world, and instead we're going to see a rise of various different types of decentralized protocols like Ethereum, like Neo, like Solana, Avalanche, all these different chains that are going to serve various different purposes and going to have standardized frameworks to be able to communicate with one another and be able to maintain that economic layer and all the features and applications built on top of it. Is that where you see things going in the long term?
Absolutely. Brilliant summary, Nick. Absolutely. Very well said. Decentralized and yet interconnected.
Very interesting. On that point, John, I want to take a bit of a step back because I understand we can easily get caught up, as we do when we get to chat and stuff. We always get caught up thinking about like the big vision of things. But one thing that I always find that I always come back to from time to time, and I think it would be worth it here on the podcast, is that you're a very I think overall, John, I think you're a very talented person. You've gone through a lot as well. You've experienced a lot. And one thing I think that is really fascinating about you as an individual is that you've not just founded one company, you founded multiple companies, and you've already exited two startups. And that's a really big achievement. It's one thing to even exit one startup, but to do two is quite impressive. And as you mentioned as well, as an immigrant to the U.S., I think that that's a beautiful story. So I would love to hear, how did you go about founding your first company, and what led you to go down that crazy rabbit hole that all founders inevitably go down?
Yes, Nick, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Absolutely. So, what led me there is, I guess, I suppose, a kind of awakening or an enlightenment that you have one life and you want to live it the way you want to live it, not based on how some nameless corporation or entity out there that you might think you're a part of. It took me a while to get there. There are some people who get there much early in life, and I got there much later. But I'm glad I just got there anyway. Right. The second thing I would say is, what did I learn from it? And this is very interesting. I've come to the conclusion, and I want to share this. Hopefully, people can benefit from this. There are only two things that you do all the time, Nick. One, you are building something. Two, you are selling something. And this is true for startups you are building, or a project you're working on, or even yourself as an individual. As an individual, you're building your skill set, you're enhancing your skill set, or you're selling yourself. And so I want to just share this as a lesson personally, which is, if you're not building or if you're not selling, you're wasting your time. And that was the acute lesson for me in building projects, building startups, and like you said, leading to exits. Is anything in between is an absolute waste of time, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. So on that point, John, if I get what you're saying correctly, and I don't mean to pigeonhole the point and stuff or anything, but I found a lot of founders who come to this realization as well, where they want to do, for example, maybe even like a good sounding thing, like a charity initiative, right? You want to like, start up like something that does something maybe small, or like, for example, it might be nonprofit. It could be just something kind of like it's. I think the problem that people run into is that there's a lot of things that might feel right, but at the end of the day, with something like a startup or a company, you can scale out, and increase productivity. You can scale out medical technologies that save thousands of lives of people you never get to meet. Is that kind of the point you're getting at and stuff? Is that with something that where you're able to turn it into a profitable business model? That's where you can really start to impact the world. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, absolutely. I think you're right. You're right. I couldn't agree with you more with your summary. But again, I want to just emphasize, right? When I say build, meaning to create, you're creating something. You're creating something could be reinventing yourself as an individual, your skill set, right? Your vocabulary. It could be languages, could be tools, could be skills, or you're selling, right? And scaling, you're right. It's about scaling. Selling is obviously about scaling the startup as well. And what I mean by this, and I'm going to be a little bit of, if you may, politically incorrect, so much of the space in between is just wasted, with respect to like HR and legal and finance and compliance. And, those are all just taxes you have to pay. And people often get confused between the taxes they have to pay and truly what they are creating and the value add. And for me, that's what I mean by saying you're either building or selling. And if you're not doing either of them, you're just wasting your time.
I'll tell you one thing, John. I always think about when it comes to tax season and stuff. Always in crypto, I've paid my taxes every single year. And the thing I always like to joke about, just to make myself feel a bit more sane, is there's nobody who wants tax reform less than tax attorneys. So, I mean, if it wasn't so complex, they'd probably be out of a job. So,
You're right. And this goes back to our earlier point, right? Which is, complexity thrives in centralized systems. People thrive in that complexity, right? And if you take it away, people get lost, right? That's the challenge we face in sort of rebuilding this infrastructure, is this massive shift of people who thrive in the corruption and the complexity.
absolutely. So one thing I was thinking about, John, so you honestly have a focus around developers, and you've been working the past couple years on this developer toolkit and stuff for the M3 ecosystem. One thing I wanted to ask you, and I get this asked a lot and stuff, like for people who really want to get into the developer space for crypto, what is your kind of go-to place for them? Like for people who want to make that career switch, as it's at the center of what you do, what's the first thing you would tell them? And are there any other kind of avenues or resources that people can turn to learn more about it?
Definitely, Nick. The one thing I would tell people, young people, people who want to aspire to get into the space, is to say, be on GitHub, live on GitHub. Social media is necessary to connect and to share, but if people want to be to play a role in building this future for tomorrow, it's going to happen at the level of code. And it doesn't mean that you have to write code, but it does mean that you have to understand code. And so I think people underestimate the need to be on GitHub to see firsthand, right, what's being built, how it's being built, right? That is a critical piece. Sometimes I think people forget, and it doesn't matter. Like I said again, you don't have to write code, but you should be able to understand the code.
Yeah, and what's nice too that I always try to explain this to people. It's not always the case, but usually, as you know, John, like with good code, usually comes good documentation, or at least usually you'll have kind of like non-active text in the code that explains what this functionality does or what it plays into. And I think that people get so overwhelmed when they go to somewhere like GitHub and they see all these different repos and like what is all of this? I can't make sense of it. But in reality, it's something that as you go through it and you start to learn how things are structured and how developers work on building things, you start to realize, okay, maybe I can't read the code, but at least I can understand and generally interpret what this component does and what broader feature does it service, what user stories does it meet, so that this protocol can deliver some kind of feature. And I think that's, again, like it's like with finance in general, where most people I meet get absolutely overwhelmed when they see a chart, when they hear about quantitative easing, when in reality, a lot of it's pretty practical concepts. It's just hidden by a lot of fancy language sometimes. I don't know if you have a similar sentiment on that.
Absolutely, Nick. Absolutely. No, you nailed it, man. In fact, I have a saying, we've used this often in the past is, it cannot be that complicated. If it is, something's wrong, right? It cannot be that complicated. And so I want to just tell people on your listeners, if somebody tells you it's too complicated for you, they're bullshitting you, right? It cannot be, right? And so you got to push back and say, no, if it's that complicated, forget about it, right? It's very simple. The fundamentals, the first principles are very simple. And this is why for me, as I build the developer toolkits, is to make it as simple as possible in about 3-4 minutes to be able to build your first smart contract. And if I cannot do it, something's wrong with the technology or my skill or the problem solving for you. So it's not that complicated, and don't let them bullshit you.
That should be the entry slogan in that case. That don't let them BS you. It's this simple. Very cool, John. So I want to go back and talk a little bit here. Probably one of the big things, and it's one of my favorite things, of course, we were chatting about earlier, is like kind of the big picture. I know a lot of people always kind of toss around like price predictions for where they see things going in the next year or so. And I'm totally fine if you want to talk about that as well. But I'm curious, John, as you're really like, I think, a visionary in the sense of seeing where things are going. I'm curious to hear where do you think we're going to be as you're on the ground working with a lot of these organizations, setting, as you mentioned, this token taxonomy, these standards, so that these protocols can interact and be utilized by enterprise. Where do you think we stand? Like, what are some big kind of calls you would feel comfortable making now for the timeline of the future and what crypto and blockchain will look like?
Thank you, Nick. So I want to be a little bit humble about it. I mean, I'll give you my perspective, right? I'll give you how I see it, and of course, people can call this, a few months later. Two things, Nick. Firstly, what we have seen with the likes of El Salvador, for example, with respect to Bitcoin, I believe the dominoes have begun to fall, and we're going to see more of that. That's going to be a very clear inflection point. Either way, as the dominoes fall, or the response that the existing infrastructure provides as the dominoes fall. Number one. Number two, I would like to think of tokens of digital assets. And I think the inflection point, which we are building up to, is going to be tokenization of real world assets. Real world assets. Yes, we can talk about the metaverse and, of course, all of that, NFTs and so on. But for me, tokenizing today's assets, real world, property, right? Houses, apartments, condominiums, commodities, pork bellies, right? Oil, right? This is going to be for me the inflection point, and this is why, for instance, the work we are doing with the GBPC, with the Interwork Alliance and the standards, because this is going to be a highly interoperable ecosystem, Nick. That digitization of real world assets for me is the second inflection point that I'm watching, which I believe will break through sometime in the medium term.
So to take back on your positions, just so I get them right, the first one is that you believe on the monetary side, on the crypto side of things, where we have like cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin that are becoming emerging stores of value or competing stores of value with traditional forms like gold and equities. You see that what we're seeing in El Salvador is going to grow even larger. We're going to see more countries, effectively, if you will, join the domino effect of starting to realize Bitcoin is legal tender, start to scare the IMF even more than it already is. And then the second theory that you put together and stuff, or at least the vision that you see, is that over the coming years, we're going to have not only these standards and protocols that we talked about earlier, but that we're going to start to have like an actual framework for all these systems to work together so that we can actually start to tokenize real world assets. And I'm interested to build a little bit more on that, because when it comes to real world assets, I think we've seen a few projects here and there that have tried to do it, that have tried to tokenize real estate, and maybe a couple other real world assets. I know there's like tokenized bonds, things of that sort, but I'm curious to hear, John, like what's holding us back from tokenizing real world assets? My understanding is that if you were to, for example, tokenize a home, I think just like NFTs or anything else out there in the crypto space, the problem is the enforcement in the real world. Is that where you see the problem, or is there a much bigger problem that I'm missing?
No, I think you nailed it, Nick. I think you're spot on. You say enforcement. I would say policy and regulations which enable again interoperability, because a critical feature here is you want liquidity, right? When you tokenize real world assets, you require liquidity. That comes from obviously multiple parties, multiple players, right? Which is, like you said, regulation, policy, right? Standards. Once again, I'll go back to my pet topic of standards. This reminds me, of the late 90s, and you had the early .com wave, right? You had people like Pets.com and WebWan, and they failed. But their failure did not mean that Amazon did not come through and take over the world, right? That's kind of how I see it. We are seeing those early players, early experiments, and yes, many will fail. But that doesn't mean in 12 months, in 18 months, in 24 months, that we will not see the industry switch. We don't have a choice, Nick. I see it really not as, this is not about a choice. We will digitize assets. It will happen. It will happen without you and me, right? And the question is, do we want to be on this wave and make sure that it's done right? Make sure it's done, for the benefit of the common man, and not once again for the benefit of, centralized power brokers.
Yeah, that's a very good point, John, is that like innovation is always going to be unstoppable. And it's really a matter of the bright minds coming together and making sure that the better interests are served with these technologies. And I think that's, again, with Web 2, and we had some great innovations. I mean, it's completely transformed our lives. But looking back, there's obviously clear flaws in Web 2. So we have to make sure we don't repeat those same flaws in Web 3. And what I like is that a lot of what Web3 is about and what all these protocols are aiming to achieve, although they're not perfect for sure, is that with these systems, they're removing the power struggle of one key entity from being able to run everything. And it's rooted in some system where everyone can at least contribute, anyone can use it, anyone can participate. And I think with a system like that, you have a much lower chance of running into a game where, hey, this is the only option in town, or the only pony show, in a sense, like where you have opportunities now. You don't have to be stuck with just one option.
Right. I like Nick. I like what you said. In fact, I want to just say one more thing. You said a much lower chance. I like it a lot, Nick. I think you're absolutely right. Right? There is no silver bullet. We know that, right? There is no perfection. And I like what you said. A much lower chance, which is let's minimize the probability that once again the systems will be biased, tilted in favor of centralized, power brokers and systems, right? But it's no, we know there is no perfection. And of course, if anybody said somehow there is this magic decentralization, once again, it's a lot of bullshit, right?
No, but to that point, that like that's the thing I always try to explain to people is like with any kind of decentralized system, even take Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't have unlimited decentralization. It does have probably one of the most heightened forms of decentralization in the sense of the nodes running the network, its geographical distribution of those nodes. It has a time-tested system that's probably made it one of the most secure ledgers on the planet, and that's important for a digital store of value. But at the same time, decentralized, as you mentioned, John, there is no silver bullet. There is no pure definition of when have we reached the threshold of peak decentralization. Because what's so great about it is that unlike centralization, where there's one source, decentralization can go on infinitely. We can scale it out as much as we feel the need to in order to secure the systems that we build. So, yeah, at least we know our hearts are in the right place, and once you can feel that momentum of something new coming and your heart's in the right place, it's usually going to turn out good.
Absolutely. But we need the checks and balances, Nick. We need the checks and balances, right? As the founding fathers said, right? If men were angels, we wouldn't need, but we know that's not the case. So we need the checks and balances in place to make sure for today and for tomorrow and beyond that these systems will stay true to the principles and the goals.
I like that, John. That's very interesting. Almost a digital constitution for these different ecosystems to interact. That's very cool. Well, I wanted to go ahead and just real quick, John, like as maybe we can wrap up here, maybe we can even open up some questions as well. I wanted to maybe close off with one key thing, which is that, as we were talking about your vision long term for the crypto space and for blockchain enterprise, what's something that you're really looking forward to in 2022 that you think is going to be achievable this year? Like like we know we've seen, for example, in 2021 we saw NFTs became a major catalyst. You mentioned the metaverse earlier, and all the while I can understand these trends. I think that we've got something more tangible, something more realistic around the corner. And do you think it's going to be tokenized assets? Do you think that's something we'll see here in 2022? Like at least one good killer application of it?
So it's a very good question, Nick. I'll give you my opinion, my humble opinion, and I could be wrong. Uh, the the wave of digitizing assets, I see it as an ongoing thing. Like this is going to be much like e-commerce. It will take multiple years to get there, but we will get there in a very big way. With respect to this particular year, my hope is that we will see DAOs, really coming through on the vision of decentralized autonomous organizations. There is a lot of talk out there. There is certainly some people pushing the envelope. I would like to believe that this year, the same way, like for example, NFTs, broke through last year, that we might see DAOs break through in a meaningful way, especially given the geopolitical state that we are in as a planet.
Very interesting, John. No, I know DAOs are overall it's a pretty like controversial topic. Like some people see them as incredibly valuable. I have some friends who are really active. I know, for example, we probably got some people listening as well and stuff who are really active in major DAOs for protocols like Uniswap and are voting on governance proposals and stuff. And there's some as well who are still waiting to see. As I think he's exactly as you put it, John, like that kind of catalyst example of a DAO in the crypto space. So I think there's so much exciting things to look to ahead in the future. And I just want to say thank you again for coming on, John. I mean, I feel like I'm looking 5-10 years in the future when I get to chat with you. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Nick. Always a pleasure, my friend. Always a pleasure and a true privilege. Thank you again for making time for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening in. It was a really good conversation. So happy to have you here, John. And we'll go ahead and we'll get it uploaded on the YouTube channel. If you guys happen to join midway, you guys can always check out the full interview and podcast episode on the YouTube channel in the near term future. So if you aren't already, just go ahead and subscribe to the deVadoss YouTube channel. And definitely go follow John if you guys haven't already. He posts some really awesome stuff in regards to some of the standards that he's working on within the various organizations like the Interwork Alliance that are helping to build standards to actually scale out blockchain. Is there any last things you wanted to share, John?
I want to say, again, just say thank you. And I want to, again, thank people who are listening in for their time. I appreciate it. Please ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter, anything you like. I'm very happy to help and support in any way. And again, a real pleasure and a privilege, Nick. Thank you. Thank you, Eugene, as well. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Take care, John. Thank you all for tuning in. And we'll see you all in the next space or the next interview. Take care, everyone.